The bustling atmosphere of Los Angeles International Airport was a symphony of sounds, rolling luggage, overhead announcements, and the chatter of eager travelers. Among them stood Keanu, a humble man, dressed in a simple yet neat outfit, dark jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. His brown hair was tousled but not unkempt, and his demeanor exuded a sense of calm that contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy around him. As he waited in the first-class line, he observed the other passengers, each adorned in designer clothes that boasted wealth and status. In front of him, a woman clutched her designer handbag, adorned with gold accents that caught the fluorescent lights. Behind him, a man in an impeccably tailored suit fidgeted with his expensive watch, glancing at his reflection in the glass windows that lined the terminal. Keanu felt out of place, but not in a way that bothered him. He had learned long ago that his worth was not defined by the fabric of his clothing or the weight of his wallet. As Keanu stood there, he caught the eye of Carlos Herrera. Carlos was the epitome of success, tall, with an air of arrogance that seemed to radiate from his perfectly groomed appearance. He wore a crisp, expensive suit, the kind that whispered of boardroom meetings and high-stakes negotiations. His hair was slicked back, and he carried himself with a confidence that bordered on haughty. Noticing Keanu, Carlos raised an eyebrow and scoffed, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk. "What's this? A first-class ticket?" Carlos's voice dripped with sarcasm as he gestured dismissively toward Keanu's attire. "They must be running low on actual passengers if they're letting anyone in here." Keanu turned, meeting Carlos's gaze with a calmness that surprised him. He could sense the disdain and judgment, but he had no intention of letting it affect him. "Yes, I have a first-class ticket," he replied evenly, maintaining a polite smile. "I believe anyone can purchase one, regardless of what they wear." Carlos laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that drew the attention of nearby travelers. "True, but it does make one wonder what you're doing here. Are you sure you're not lost? This isn't a charity flight, my friend." Keanu's smile remained, unfazed by the jabs. He could feel the heat of Carlos's arrogance, but he chose to respond with kindness rather than anger. "I believe that everyone deserves to travel comfortably. It's not about appearance, but the journey we take. Wouldn't you agree?" Carlos's eyes narrowed, clearly taken aback by Keanu's unexpected response. He had expected a flustered reaction, perhaps even an apology, but instead he was met with a composure that irked him. "Look, I'm just saying that some people clearly don't belong in first class. You don't strike me as someone who can appreciate the finer things in life." Keanu shrugged, the weight of Carlos's words sliding off him like water off a duck's back. Appreciating the finer things isn't solely about wealth or status. It's about experiences and connections with others. After all, we're all here for the same reason: to reach our destinations. Carlos frowned, his expression darkening as he crossed his arms over his chest. "You may think that, but let's be honest. Some people just don't belong in the same space as others. It's about merit, not just a ticket." Keanu took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Merit can be subjective, Carlos. What defines our worth is often more profound than what can be measured by social standards. For instance, kindness and respect go a long way, don't you think?" Carlos chuckled derisively, his voice laced with disbelief. "Kindness? Respect? Those are nice ideas, but they don't pay the bills or keep you at the top. In my world, it's all about power and influence." Keanu regarded Carlos thoughtfully, sensing the layers of insecurity behind his bravado. "And what does that power bring you? Is it happiness, fulfillment, or is it merely a facade for something deeper?" Carlos bristled at the question, his arrogance flaring. "You don't know anything about me or what I've achieved. You think you can sit here in your plain clothes and lecture me about life? You have no idea what it's like to earn your place." "Perhaps," Keanu acknowledged, his voice steady. "But I do know that success isn't solely defined by wealth or status. It's also about the impact we have on others and the legacy we leave behind." Carlos scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in the air. "Impact, legacy, those are just fancy words for people who can't cut it in the real world. If you want to succeed, you have to play the game, not philosophize about it." "Maybe," Keanu replied, his tone unwavering. "But I believe that true success is about lifting others as you rise, not just climbing to the top for the sake of it. What's the point of being at the top if you're alone?" The two men stood in stark contrast. Carlos, the embodiment of wealth and arrogance, and Keanu, a beacon of humility and simple wisdom. The air between them crackled with tension, a palpable division that seemed to draw the attention of those around them. Keanu's calmness acted as a counterbalance to Carlos's bravado, and slowly other passengers began to notice the exchange. "Look at that guy," whispered a woman to her friend, her eyes darting between Keanu and Carlos. "He's really standing his ground." "Yeah, I'd love to see how this plays out," her friend replied, leaning in closer. Carlos, feeling the eyes of others upon him, straightened his posture, determined to maintain his dominance in the conversation. "You think you're wise because you can spout off some quotes? Life isn't a philosophy class. It's a competition, and I intend to win." "I never claimed to be wise," Keanu replied simply, still unfazed. "But I've learned that kindness and understanding often yield better results than cold ambition. It's the connections we forge with others that matter in the end." Carlos's smirk faltered for a moment as he processed Keanu's words. The disdain he had directed toward the man before him began to waver, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He had built his entire identity around his success, yet here was someone challenging the very foundation of his beliefs without raising his voice or losing his composure. "Whatever you say, man," Carlos muttered, attempting to regain his footing. "Just remember, in the end, it's the money that talks." Keanu smiled softly, his eyes reflecting a deep well of understanding. "Money may talk, but it often lacks the authenticity that true relationships bring. I hope one day you'll come to see that." As they continued to stand in line, the tension hung in the air, thick and unyielding. Keanu remained calm, while Carlos grappled with the seeds of doubt planted in his mind. The disparity between their philosophies lingered, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither could have anticipated. As the passengers shuffled forward, the imposing figure of Carlos Herrera loomed, his tailored suit hugging his broad shoulders. He glanced over his shoulder, spotting Keanu moving steadily behind him. The contrast was stark. Carlos, a picture of wealth and privilege; Keanu, a humble embodiment of simplicity. The first-class boarding line was a microcosm of society, and the two men stood at opposing ends. "Tell me, what does someone like you do to afford a seat up here?" Carlos sneered, turning slightly to face Keanu, a smirk etched on his face. The other passengers, already settling into their seats, cast curious glances, intrigued by the unfolding drama. Keanu, unfazed, met Carlos's gaze with calm eyes. "I believe everyone has their reasons for being here, don't you?" His voice was steady, lacking the defensiveness one might expect. He brushed a hand through his hair, a simple gesture that seemed to diffuse the tension brewing in the air. Carlos scoffed, his laughter cutting through the murmurs of the passengers around them. "Sure, but I can't imagine what kind of reason would land you in first class. Are you a personal assistant or something?" He leaned in slightly, his tone dripping with mockery. "Or perhaps you just won a contest?" Keanu shook his head, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I'm just a man who believes in the importance of kindness and connection." His words hung in the air, a direct challenge to Carlos's arrogant demeanor. "Kindness?" Carlos echoed, raising an eyebrow, disbelief etched across his face. "Kindness doesn't pay for first-class seats. Let me tell you, it's all about money and power. You should know that by now." He waved a dismissive hand, as if batting away the very notion of human connection. As they progressed down the jet bridge, Keanu felt the weight of the moment. He considered how this encounter might unfold and whether it could lead to something deeper. "You know," he began thoughtfully, "I once met a man who had everything: wealth, status, the finest things money could buy. But he was the loneliest person I've ever encountered. He taught me that what truly matters is not what you have, but how you treat others." Carlos rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Spare me the sentimentality. You think your little stories can change the facts of life? People like me build empires. You?" He gestured vaguely at Keanu, as if encompassing his entire being. "You're just a footnote in someone else's story." "Maybe," Keanu replied, his tone unwavering. "But every footnote has a purpose. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can leave the biggest impact. I'd rather be a footnote that brings a smile than a chapter filled with bitterness." He took a deep breath, feeling the tension rising, but he refused to let it define him. Carlos snorted. "You talk about kindness as if it's a currency. Well, let me tell you, In the real world, money is what matters. It's what gets you respect. It's what opens doors. His voice was louder than necessary, and a few heads turned, the whispers beginning to ripple through the cabin. As they reached the airplane door, Keanu paused, taking a moment to observe Carlos. And yet, here we are, both of us waiting to board this flight. What's the point of all that wealth if you can't find a genuine connection? He stepped onto the plane, his demeanor calm, contrasting sharply with Carlos's escalating arrogance. Once inside, the cabin buzzed with the chatter of passengers settling into their seats. Carlos plopped down in his plush chair, adjusting his cufflinks with a flourish. He couldn't help but glance over at Keanu, who had taken a seat a few rows back. The man's simplicity seemed to irritate him further, and he leaned over the armrest of his seat, lowering his voice just enough to ensure Keanu could hear. Tell me, do you even have a real job? Or are you just waiting for someone to hand you a break? Carlos's voice dripped with condescension, his eyes narrowing as if he were scrutinizing an insect. Keanu looked up, unfazed, and replied, I've spent years working with at-risk youth, helping them find their way, building their confidence. He leaned back in his seat, adding with a hint of warmth, It's incredibly rewarding. Carlos chuckled darkly. Ah, the noble savior. That's cute. But tell me, how does that pay the bills? Do you expect to be a hero on a budget? The laughter from nearby passengers began to grow, a mixture of amusement and disbelief at Carlos's blatant disregard for Keanu's mission. Keanu remained composed. Perhaps it's not about the money. Maybe it's about making a difference in someone's life. You'd be surprised how far a little kindness can go. He smiled genuinely, as if sharing a secret. Carlos waved a hand dismissively, shaking his head as if to clear away the very notion. You really believe that? Kindness doesn't get you a mansion or a yacht. I could show you the world of success, but you'd have to leave your little fairy tales behind. His voice was louder now, almost challenging, inviting anyone nearby to join in on his mockery. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, whispers filled the cabin, passengers exchanging looks. The atmosphere thickened with tension, and Keanu could sense the shift. The laughter was now tinged with discomfort. Look around, Keanu said softly, nodding toward the other passengers. People don't just want wealth, they crave connection. They want to feel valued for who they are, not what they own. Carlos leaned back, crossing his arms defiantly. And what do you think that connection buys you? Nothing? It's all smoke and mirrors. You keep your kindness, and I'll keep my success. You might find, Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm, that real success isn't measured by the things you possess. It's about the lives you touch and the love you share. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, even Carlos seemed taken aback, his bravado faltering. The murmurs grew louder, and a few passengers turned to face Carlos, their expressions a mix of sympathy for Keanu and judgment for the man who seemed to revel in his own arrogance. The tension was palpable, and Keanu's heart raced, not from fear but from the sheer weight of the moment. Carlos shifted uncomfortably, the eyes of the cabin now upon him. The laughter had faded, replaced by a collective discomfort that pressed in like the walls of the airplane itself. Keanu's composure remained a stark contrast to Carlos's growing agitation. Are you really going to sit there and tell me that kindness is more important than success? Carlos challenged, his voice rising slightly, a desperate edge creeping in. You think that's how the world works? You think people care about your kindness when they're trying to pay their bills? Keanu looked around, noting the glances exchanged between the passengers. Perhaps they do care, Carlos. Maybe they care more than you think. You don't have to be wealthy to make an impact. You just have to be willing to open your heart. He returned Carlos's gaze, unwavering. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the atmosphere remained charged, the weight of their exchange hanging over the cabin like a thick fog. The engines roared to life, but the sound was drowned out by the tension that had built between the two men. Carlos finally turned away, visibly agitated, his eyes darting around the cabin, searching for an escape from the uncomfortable spotlight. Yet, Keanu's calm presence remained, a steady anchor in the storm of Carlos's ego. The plane lifted off, and as they soared into the sky, the distance between their worlds seemed to grow vast, leaving behind the echoes of a conversation that would linger long after they reached their destination. As the plane soared above the clouds, the hum of the engines created a backdrop to the escalating tension between Carlos and Keanu. Seated in the plush first-class cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of unspoken words. Carlos leaned back in his seat, an air of superiority surrounding him. He glanced at Keanu, who sat calmly, seemingly unfazed by the lavishness that surrounded them. "Did you know," Carlos began, his voice dripping with arrogance, "that I just closed a deal worth millions? It's a game changer for my company. I'm telling you, success is all about knowing the right people and making the right moves." He smirked, relishing the opportunity to showcase his wealth. Keanu turned slightly to face Carlos, his expression neutral. "That's impressive, Carlos," he replied, his voice steady. "But I've learned that success isn't solely about money or deals. It's about the connections you forge and the impact you have on others." Carlos scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. "Impact? What are you, some kind of philosopher? The world doesn't run on kindness, my friend. It runs on profits and power. You need to be ruthless to get ahead." He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "People like you don't understand that. You're too busy pretending to be humble while the real players are out there making things happen." Keanu remained composed, his gaze unwavering. Ruthlessness often leaves a trail of broken relationships. What good is success if you can't share it with others? A life filled with compassion and understanding can be far more rewarding than a bank account overflowing with money. "Compassion?" Carlos laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the cabin. "That's just a nice way of saying you're okay with mediocrity. You think kindness will pay the bills? Wake up. This is reality." Around them, other passengers began to shift in their seats, intrigued by the unfolding confrontation. Whispers filled the air, eyes darting between the two men. Keanu's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Carlos's growing agitation. "You know," Keanu said, his voice low but firm, "I've seen people with vast fortunes who are utterly miserable, and I've met those with little to their name, yet they radiate joy and fulfillment. It's about how you choose to live your life." Carlos's expression hardened. "You're just some nobody trying to sound wise. You think anyone cares about your life lessons? You don't belong in first class. You don't even belong in this conversation." "Perhaps," Keanu replied thoughtfully, "but I believe we're all entitled to our perspectives, no matter our status. You might find that the less you cling to your wealth, the more you can truly enjoy life." "Enjoy life?" Carlos shot back. "What do you even know about enjoying life? You're just sitting there, quiet as a mouse, while I'm out there making moves. You're a joke." Keanu took a deep breath, maintaining his composure despite the venom in Carlos's words. "You're right. I may not have the same experiences as you in the business world, but I've traveled enough to see that true joy often comes from simple things. A genuine smile, a heartfelt conversation, or a moment shared with someone you care about." Carlos rolled his eyes, but a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "You really believe that? You think some touchy-feely nonsense is what life is about?" Keanu leaned forward slightly, his tone earnest. "I believe that when you focus solely on material gain, you risk losing sight of what truly matters. Wealth can vanish in an instant, but the relationships you build and the lives you touch can last forever." The cabin was now enveloped in an uneasy silence, passengers keenly aware of the conversation unfolding. Some exchanged glances, sensing the tension crackling in the air. "Look," Carlos said, his bravado faltering for a moment. "I've worked hard for what I have. I'm not about to let some nobody lecture me on life." "Hard work is admirable," Keanu acknowledged. "But I wonder, at what cost? What sacrifices have you made along the way? Are those sacrifices worth it if you're left feeling empty?" Carlos hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "You think I'm empty?" he challenged, but there was less conviction in his voice. "Sometimes," Keanu replied quietly. "The loudest person in the room is the one who's the most afraid. I can't help but wonder what drives your need to boast. Perhaps it's a fear of not being enough without the accolades." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Carlos looked away, staring out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. His mind raced, grappling with the unexpected challenge to his worldview. "You don't know me," he finally said, almost defensively. "You don't know what I've been through to get here." Keanu nodded, his expression softening. "You're right, I don't. But I do know that everyone has their battles. Success can be a mask we wear to hide our insecurities. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Carlos opened his mouth to retort, but found himself at a loss for words. The sincerity in Keanu's voice pierced through the walls he had built around himself. He quickly glanced around, noticing the curious eyes of the other passengers, who were now fully engaged in the exchange. "Why would you even care?" Carlos asked, his tone laced with confusion. "You're a star. You could be talking to anyone you wanted, yet here you are, talking to me." "Because," Keanu replied, his voice steady, "I believe that everyone deserves to be heard, and I think it's important to challenge each other. You might find that vulnerability can lead to genuine strength." Carlos shifted in his seat, uncertainty flooding his thoughts. He had spent years building a fortress around his ego, and now, faced with this unexpected perspective, the cracks began to show. "Strength," he echoed, almost as if tasting the word for the first time. "What do you know about strength?" "I know," Keanu said softly, "that admitting you're struggling is one of the strongest things you can do. It takes courage to be honest with yourself and others." Carlos stared at him, the bravado fading from his eyes. He felt exposed, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. "Maybe you're right," he muttered almost inaudibly. "Maybe," Keanu offered, a hint of encouragement in his tone. "It's never too late to reevaluate what success means to you." The conversation lingered in the air, a mixture of tension and introspection. Carlos remained silent, his mind racing with thoughts he had long buried beneath layers of arrogance and pride. The flicker of doubt had ignited something within him, a desire to reconsider everything he had held dear. Across the aisle, passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with Keanu's sentiments, while others seemed intrigued by the unfolding shift in Carlos's demeanor. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed, reflecting a collective awareness of the deeper themes at play. Carlos leaned back in his seat, staring out the window again, this time as if searching for answers in the endless sea of clouds. Keanu's words echoed in his mind, challenging him to confront the very foundation of his identity. As the flight continued, the tension between the two men morphed into something more profound, an invitation to explore the true meaning of success, connection, and the human experience. The cabin of the plane hummed softly, filled with the subtle sounds of passengers settling into their seats, the rustle of magazines, and the occasional clink of glasses. In stark contrast to this serene atmosphere, the tension between Keanu and Carlos had reached a boiling point. Keanu, seated comfortably by the window, felt the weight of Carlos's arrogance bearing down on him like a heavy fog. Yet, he remained calm, embodying a tranquility that seemed to agitate Carlos even further. "Why do you always have to act like you know better?" Carlos snapped, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a knife. "You think your little stories about kindness and humility mean anything in the real world? This is a place for winners, not dreamers." His tone dripped with disdain, and the way he spat out the word dreamers was almost venomous. Keanu turned slightly in his seat, his expression steady. "Winners, is that what you call yourself?" he replied, his voice low but clear. "You flaunt your success like a badge, yet here you are, belittling someone you don't even know. It sounds more like you're trying to convince yourself of your worth than actually believing it." Carlos's face flushed with anger. "You don't know the first thing about me. I built my empire from nothing. I've sacrificed everything to get to where I am." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "What have you done? What can you possibly know about sacrifice?" Keanu took a deep breath, unperturbed by the confrontation. "Sacrifice isn't always about money or power, Carlos. Sometimes it's about choosing to be kind when it's easier to be cruel. Sometimes it's about listening instead of talking." His gaze was unwavering, piercing through Carlos's bravado. "And sometimes it's about recognizing that everyone you encounter is fighting their own battles, even if you can't see them." The cabin had fallen silent, other passengers leaning in slightly, intrigued by the unfolding drama. A few exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Carlos, feeling the heat of their attention, squared his shoulders, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Don't lecture me about battles," he retorted, his voice rising. "I've fought tooth and nail to be where I am, and I refuse to let some nobody tell me how to live my life." His arrogance was palpable, yet a flicker of doubt danced behind his eyes, a crack in the armor he had carefully constructed over the years. Keanu's demeanor remained serene. You may have fought your way to the top, but at what cost? You surround yourself with people who only see your wealth, not the person you are inside. You're lonely, Carlos. You may not want to admit it, but I see it. Carlos's jaw clenched, his agitation spilling over. You think you can psychoanalyze me? Who do you think you are? You're just a cheap reminder of what I left behind. His voice echoed through the small space, and the passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension thickening with each word. Am I? Keanu replied softly, his tone almost disarming. Or am I just a reflection of what you've become? It's easy to wear a mask of success, but eventually you have to take it off and face yourself. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to remind you that there's more to life than what fits in your bank account. Carlos leaned back, his posture rigid. He felt cornered, the walls closing in as Keanu's words washed over him like cold water. The flight attendants glanced nervously at one another, unsure whether to intervene, but the atmosphere was charged with an electric tension that seemed to demand resolution. Why do you care? Carlos spat, desperation creeping into his voice. What difference does it make to you? You're just some wannabe philosopher trying to impress everyone around you with your wisdom. The disdain was evident, but beneath it lay a tremor of uncertainty, a crack in the facade he had built. Keanu met his gaze, unwavering. Because I've been where you are, Carlos. I've known the emptiness that comes from chasing success without understanding what truly matters. And I've learned that it's not about the money or the power. It's about the connections we make along the way, the kindness we show to others. Carlos's expression shifted, if only for a moment, as Keanu's words resonated within him. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something. Doubt, perhaps, or the faintest inkling of remorse. But he quickly buried it beneath a snarl, unwilling to let Keanu see any sign of weakness. You think you're so enlightened, don't you? He shot back, trying to regain his footing. You're just a simple man with simple ideas. The world doesn't work the way you want it to. Maybe it doesn't, Keanu replied, his voice soothing yet firm. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to make it better. It starts with each of us, with the choices we make every day. You can choose to lash out, or you can choose to listen. You can choose to isolate yourself, or connect with others. It's your call. The silence in the cabin deepened, heavy with the weight of Keanu's words. Carlos fidgeted in his seat, the tension coiling tighter around him. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, waiting to see how he would respond. You're full of it, he finally muttered, but there was a quiver in his voice that betrayed his bravado. Deep down, he knew Keanu was pushing him to confront something he had long ignored, the hollowness of his existence, the loneliness that accompanied his wealth. Keanu leaned back, a slight smile playing on his lips, as if he had expected this reaction. Maybe, but you can't deny the truth in what I'm saying. It's worth considering. We're all in this together, Carlos. Carlos turned away, his heart pounding in his chest. You don't know me, he said, almost as a mantra. You don't know anything about my life. True, Keanu admitted, his voice steady. But I know enough to see that you're struggling, and I know that there's a better path available to you, one that doesn't involve arrogance and condescension. It's never too late to change, to choose kindness over cruelty. As Carlos absorbed Keanu's words, a storm of emotions raged within him. The anger he felt was palpable, but beneath it lay a kernel of truth that gnawed at him. He had spent so long building walls around himself, convinced that vulnerability was a weakness. Yet here was this man, simple yet profound, challenging everything he had ever believed. I don't need your advice, Carlos shot back, but even he could hear the hollowness of his words. Maybe not, Keanu replied softly, but it might help to listen. You might find something valuable in it. Carlos remained silent, staring out the window, watching the clouds drift by. The view was breathtaking, a sea of white stretching infinitely across the sky, yet he felt trapped within his own mind, battling a tempest of conflicting thoughts. The cabin remained quiet, the other passengers sensing the shift in the atmosphere. There was something raw and real about the exchange, an unspoken understanding that weighed heavily on the air. Keanu's calm presence stood in stark contrast to Carlos's turmoil, and for the first time, Carlos felt exposed. Just leave me alone, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded slowly, respecting his wishes. "I will. But remember, Carlos, every choice you make will shape who you are. You have the power to change your story. Don't forget that." As Keanu settled back into his seat, Carlos felt the weight of those words linger in the air. The battle within him raged on, but for the first time, he was aware of the possibility of change, a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. Little did he know, the revelation awaiting him would soon shatter everything he thought he knew about success and what it meant to truly connect with others. Just as Carlos was about to unleash another scathing retort, the cabin of the airplane was interrupted by the flight attendant's voice, resonating through the overhead speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special announcement. We are pleased to inform you that joining us today is the acclaimed actor Keanu Reeves." A hush fell over the cabin, the murmurs of disbelief and excitement weaving through the rows of seats. Carlos's expression shifted from defiance to confusion, and then to something resembling horror. He glanced around, his bravado dissolving into the air like mist in sunlight. The whispers grew louder, passengers leaning in closer to catch a glimpse of the star who had just been announced. Keanu, seated a few rows ahead, turned slightly in his chair, as if he could sense the stir of energy around him. He offered a friendly smile, a gesture that seemed to radiate warmth and calm, contrasting sharply with the tension that had just filled the cabin. Carlos's face paled as the realization hit him like a cold wave. He had been belittling not just a man, but a Hollywood icon, someone whose films had inspired millions. His mind raced as he replayed their interaction, each sarcastic remark and condescending jab ringing louder in his ears. "I can't believe I was talking to him like that," he muttered under his breath, the gravity of his arrogance sinking in. Keanu, still with that easy smile, caught the eye of the flight attendant and nodded graciously. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm and inviting. "It's always a pleasure to share a flight with fellow travelers." The flight attendant beamed at him, clearly excited to be in the presence of someone so famous. "Would you like anything special during the flight, Mr. Reeves?" "Oh, just the usual, thank you," Keanu replied with a humble nod. "I appreciate it." Carlos watched in disbelief as the flight attendant practically glowed under Keanu's attentiveness. It was evident that the actor's presence transformed the atmosphere of the cabin, replacing the earlier tension with a palpable sense of admiration. Noticing the shift, Carlos's heart began to race. He felt exposed, as if everyone could see through his layers of arrogance and bravado. He turned slightly in his seat to catch Keanu's eye, hoping to find a hint of disdain, or at least some acknowledgement of the humiliation he felt. Instead, Keanu's gaze was steady and compassionate, as if he could sense the turmoil within Carlos, and was silently urging him to confront it. "Mr. Herrera," Keanu spoke softly, leaning just a bit closer, his voice low but clear enough for Carlos to hear. "It's easy to forget that we're all human, isn't it?" Carlos blinked, caught off guard. The sincerity in Keanu's words pierced through his defenses. "What do you mean?" he managed to reply, his tone lacking its usual bravado. Keanu's expression softened, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding. "We often measure ourselves by what we have or how we appear to others. But in reality, it's how we treat people that matters most. None of this." He waved a hand around the lavish interior of the first-class cabin. "None of this defines who we are." Carlos shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the weight of Keanu's gaze. "You don't understand," he responded, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "I've worked hard for everything I have. I've earned my place here, and I respect that," Keanu replied gently. "But sometimes, the harder we cling to our status, the more we disconnect from the very essence of what makes us human. It's not about what you've achieved, but how you connect with others along the way." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Carlos felt a flush of shame creeping up his neck. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental. The whispers had returned, but this time they were not about Keanu's celebrity. They were about him, the man who had dared to mock someone so genuine. "Why are you telling me this?" Carlos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because it's never too late to change," Keanu answered, his tone imbued with kindness. "We all have the power to redefine our stories. It's a choice we make every day." Carlos swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being a self-made man. Yet, here was Keanu, someone who could easily flaunt his status, choosing instead to emphasize connection and kindness. Carlos's internal struggle grew louder. The hollowness of his own achievements began to echo painfully in his mind. "Maybe you're right," Carlos finally admitted, his voice cracking. "Maybe I have been too focused on everything else." Keanu nodded, his demeanor calm and composed. "It's not an easy path to walk, but acknowledging it is the first step. We're all fighting our battles, even if they look different on the outside." The cabin fell into a somewhat reverent silence, the passengers absorbing the exchange. Carlos felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mix of judgment and empathy. He could sense that they were witnessing a moment of vulnerability, and it both terrified and liberated him. "I don't want to be that man anymore," Carlos said, a sudden determination rising within him. "I don't want to be defined by my wealth or status. I want to matter, to connect, like you do." Keanu smiled, a genuine and warm expression that radiated encouragement. "Then start by treating everyone around you with respect. Listen to their stories. You'll find that true wealth comes from the connections we build, not the money we accumulate." As Carlos absorbed Keanu's words, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. The arrogance that had once been his armor began to feel like a burden he was ready to cast aside. "I want to make a difference," Carlos said, his voice steadier now. "I want to be someone worth respecting." Keanu nodded, his eyes gleaming with approval. "That's the spirit. Remember, it's never too late to start fresh. You have the power to shape your narrative." At that moment, Carlos understood that the journey ahead would not be easy. Changing one's mindset, especially after years of cultivating a persona rooted in arrogance and superiority, would be a formidable task. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. As the flight continued, the atmosphere shifted. The passengers, who had been caught up in the spectacle of celebrity, now witnessed something far more profound, a moment of genuine human connection. The once disparaging remarks from Carlos were replaced by a willingness to listen, to learn, and to grow. In the seats around him, Carlos could see the faces of his fellow travelers soften as they absorbed the exchange. Perhaps, just perhaps, they too could sense the transformative power of kindness and humility that Keanu embodied so effortlessly. And as the plane soared through the skies, Carlos realized that this flight was not just a journey to a destination, but a turning point in his life. The man who had once believed in the supremacy of wealth was now beginning to understand the true meaning of success, the connections we forge and the love we give to others. As the plane touched down on the tarmac at Los Angeles International Airport, Carlos Herrera remained seated, his heart racing, not from the thrill of landing, but from the realization that he had just spent several hours belittling a man who was not just any man, but Keanu Reeves, a Hollywood icon. The plane's cabin buzzed with the excitement of disembarkation, but Carlos was lost in his thoughts, his mind replaying the moments of confrontation that had unfolded during the flight. He watched as Keanu stood up, effortlessly charming the flight attendants who approached him with genuine smiles. The contrast between the two men was stark. Where Carlos exuded an air of superiority, Keanu radiated warmth and humility. Carlos observed how Keanu took the time to engage with the crew, asking them about their lives and thanking them for their service, his voice soft yet resonant. There was an authenticity in Keanu's interactions that made Carlos feel small and insignificant. "Mr. Reeves," a young woman exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she approached him. Carlos couldn't hear the specifics of their conversation, but he could see the way Keanu leaned in, listening intently, making the fan feel valued. He posed for a selfie with her, his smile genuine, not forced or rehearsed. It was a simple act, but it resonated deeply with the people around him. Carlos shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing. He had spent so much of his life building an empire, amassing wealth. And yet, here was a man who had achieved fame and fortune, yet chose to use it to uplift others. The juxtaposition of their lives began to weigh heavily on Carlos. He had always believed that success was measured in dollars and status, but now he felt a stirring in his heart, a longing for something he had never pursued, genuine human connection. As the passengers began to exit the plane, Carlos found himself hesitating. He watched as Keanu continued to engage with fans, posing for pictures and signing autographs. The atmosphere was electric, charged with admiration and respect. Carlos felt a pang of envy, not for Keanu's fame, but for the ease with which he connected with others. "What am I doing wrong?" he whispered to himself, grappling with the realization that his life had become a series of empty victories. "Hey buddy, you coming or what?" a voice called out, snapping Carlos back to reality. It was one of his colleagues, a fellow businessman who had been seated a few rows back. Carlos stood up, trying to shake off the weight of his reflections, but the thoughts clung to him like a shadow. As he stepped into the aisle, he caught one last glimpse of Keanu, who was now surrounded by a small group, sharing a laugh. The laughter was infectious, and Carlos felt a pang of longing to be a part of that warmth. Once off the plane, Carlos found himself trailing behind the crowd, his colleague chatting animatedly about a recent business deal. Carlos nodded absent-mindedly, his mind still occupied by the flight. "You okay, man? You seem a little off today," his colleague remarked, noticing the glazed look in his eyes. "Yeah, just thinking," Carlos replied, shaking his head slightly as if to clear it. He couldn't quite articulate the shift that was happening within him, but he felt a flicker of hope igniting. Perhaps it wasn't too late to change his approach to life. Perhaps there was more to success than what he had always pursued. As they made their way through the bustling airport, the noise of announcements and the bustle of travelers surrounded them. Carlos's thoughts drifted back to Keanu. He had never considered the possibility that someone so famous could be so grounded. It was a revelation that shook his entire belief system. Could it be that true success lay in the connections one made, the kindness one showed, rather than in power and wealth? Just then, as they passed a coffee shop, Carlos overheard a conversation that made him stop in his tracks. A couple of young men were chatting animatedly discussing a recent news piece about Keanu and his charitable actions. "Did you hear? He volunteers at shelters every week. Can you believe that? He's not just an actor, he's genuinely a good person," one of the men exclaimed, his eyes wide with admiration. "Yeah, I read that he uses his fame to help others. He really gives back," the other added, nodding thoughtfully. "It's refreshing, you know, not like most celebrities who just care about their image." Carlos felt a lump form in his throat. The revelation was like a punch to the gut, forcing him to confront the reality of his own choices. Here was a man who had every reason to be self-absorbed, yet he chose to uplift those less fortunate. Carlos felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, often at the expense of his humanity, while Keanu had used his platform to make a difference. "What's wrong with me?" Carlos muttered under his breath, the weight of his arrogance crashing down around him. He stood frozen as his colleague continued walking, oblivious to the internal battle waging within Carlos. The realization that he had been so caught up in his own success blinded him to what truly mattered in life was overwhelming. He turned back towards the coffee shop, intending to catch another glimpse of Keanu, or perhaps even approach him, but the crowd had thickened. Instead, he watched as Keanu exited the terminal, surrounded by a few fans who were still eager to engage with him. He saw the way Keanu's eyes lit up with every interaction, how he made each person feel seen and important. In that moment, Carlos made a decision. He could not change the past, but he could change the future. He could choose to embrace humility, to seek connections with others, and to use his resources to contribute positively to the world around him. It was a daunting prospect, but for the first time in a long while, it felt exhilarating. As he turned to follow his colleague, a sense of purpose began to take root in his heart. The life he had led had been about accumulation, but now he yearned for something deeper, a life filled with meaning, connection, and compassion. Perhaps it was time to step into a new chapter, one where he could redefine success on his own terms, inspired by the man he had once dismissed so easily. With every step he took away from the terminal, he felt lighter, as if the burden of his arrogance had begun to lift. Carlos Herrera was ready to embrace a new beginning, one where he could write a different story, one of kindness, humility, and genuine human connection.